All right, here we go. Judges, the downward spiral. We're going to be getting into this Bible study where we look at the book of Judges. Hopefully, this will take about maybe 10 sessions or so. We'll sort of see how this goes. Let's begin the downward spiral. And the downward spiral best characterizes the book of Judges, and that's going to sort of be our mascot. I'll give you a sneak peek of this. The downward spiral. You think of it sort of like as a tornado. One of the themes running through Judges is this idea of the downward spiral of things moving in a cyclical manner, but they move with purpose. So it's sort of like a spiral, but things keep getting worse and worse and worse. So it's like a downward spiral. And if you think of like a tornado, of how it is and how the point of the lowest point is the point of destruction, it kind of works with what we're talking about in Judges. So let's get into the downward spiral. Let's look at an overview of Judges. That's sort of what we're doing in this first session, is getting a bird's eye view of the book and some of the things going on in the book, so that then when we go through it piece by piece, we sort of have a better idea of how these things interact with one another. So we're going to look at the structure of Judges, look at some of the background and foreground scriptures, and look at some of the overarching themes. One of the first things we're going to talk about is the structure of Judges. And Judges is a book. It is a narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, as I like to call it, the prologue, the character stories, and the epilogue. And because of this, we sort of need to approach it as a narrative, as a book. It's not so concerned about history or chronology, the writer of Judges. So we need to keep that into account. He's trying to make a theological point. The Bible is about theology, not so much about history and chronology, although those things do play into it. We need to keep at the forefront of our mind when we're going into Judges that this book is trying to make a theological point. So history and chronology play second fiddle to the theology of the book. So we're going to keep our eye on the theology, because that's what the writer of Judges is wanting us to pay attention to. So as we jump into this first part, the structure of Judges, I want you to keep that in mind. So the first part, the prologue. This is the beginning of Judges, chapter 1, basically, through chapter 3. We see a couple of things happening here in the beginning of Judges. We see political decline and religious decline. Now, what I mean by political decline is, I guess, what you would typically think of. It's people-to-people interactions, right? If you think of modern political parties, that's sort of what it is. It's people-to-people conflict, people-to-people stuff happening. So when I talk about political decline in Judges, in the beginning of Judges, we're talking about the people-to-people interactions. And one of the things we see in the beginning of Judges is that Israel is going into the promised land, and they're dealing with the people of the land, and they're supposed to sort of drive them out. They're supposed to kick them out. Really, they're supposed to eradicate them. And Israel fails to do that. So we have this political decline, this people-to-people decline, where Israel doesn't do what God has told them to do, and so they have to suffer consequences for that. Basically, what God does in this first chapter or so is he sends the angel of the Lord, and he confronts Israel about their lack of obedience, and there are consequences to that obedience, and he basically sets that out in that first chapter. And this thus begins sets the stage, so to speak, for the downward spiral. Things go downhill from here because the people start off with disobedience. So that's sort of the political decline. Now, there's also religious decline in Judges in this first section here in the prologue. And that's from chapter 2 to basically chapter 3. And the religious decline is the people to God relationship. So one of the things that happens in the beginning of Judges, and what we see happening throughout, is that the Israelites basically abandon God. They abandon Yahweh. And throughout this study, I'm going to try and refer to God as Yahweh, because we're going to be talking about the other gods of the land, the Baals and the Ashtaras. So I want to refer to Yahweh with his proper name, so that it's clearer when it comes to talking about this, because if we just always use the generic term God or little gods, it can get a little confusing. So I'm going to try and just say Yahweh when I mean the Lord, or God with a big G. But there's this religious decline, and the Israelites did what was evil by abandoning Yahweh and worshiping the foreign gods. This is part of that issue with assimilation in the land that Yahweh, warned them about. So we have this religious decline where people just did not do what God was telling them. I'm doing it again. What Yahweh was telling them to do, and this relationship between the Israelites and their God declines. And so what does Yahweh do in response to this? Them abandoning him? Well, he gives them over to their enemies as punishment. But Yahweh then has compassion and sends a deliverer to save them. This is where the judges come in. The judges are considered deliverers that Yahweh sends to save Israel from their enemies. So in the beginning of this prologue, we see kind of this twofold thing happening. The people-to-people conflicts and the people-to-God conflicts. And this sets the stage for this downward spiral because things just keep getting worse and worse and worse among people to people and among the Israelites to Yahweh. So we're going to see that develop as we go through the study of Judges. So that was the prologue. That's the introduction to Judges. Now we get into the character stories, or as I like to think of it, like the meat of Judges. So these character stories basically follow the different judges that that Yahweh raises up to deliver the Israelites from the hands of their enemies. The first one that comes up is Othniel. Othniel is like your prototype judge. He's the judge that gets it right. He's the judge that sets the stage for the rest of the judges. He sets the bar very high, and each one of the judges fails to reach it. And in fact, each one of the judges, to a certain extent, keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse until we land at Samson, the last judge, which he's like the worst of the worst. But Othniel sets the stage of what the judge is supposed to look like and what they're supposed to be doing. Then after Othniel, we have Ehud. Ehud is a Benjaminite, a man of, or a son of the right hand, as Benjamin means, but he's a man who has a crippled right hand. So at the beginning of his judgeship, you're already supposed to be questioning his ability to even judge well, because he's has a crippled right hand. When he's a son of the right hand, he's supposed to be strong in his right hand, so to speak. So already you see the downward spiral continuing. You have Othniel, who does everything well. Then you have Ehud, who already has a flaw from the very beginning. Then we move in chapter 4 and 5 to Deborah and Barak and Jael. Now, the Deborah, Barak, Jael judgeship story is supposed to call into question for the reader, that's for you and me, of who the real judge is. Is it Deborah? Is it Barak? Is it Jael? The writer of Judges is making you question this because it seems like it could be Deborah, but Deborah really isn't given any sort of military commission. Barak is given a military commission by Yahweh through Deborah, but Barak really doesn't fulfill it. The one who fulfills it is Jael. She's the one who kills the commander of the foreign army, who then liberates, to a certain extent, Israel from their captors. So it's supposed to call into question who's the real judge and really point you to Yahweh himself as being the sovereign king of Israel. We'll see that when we get into that story. Then after Deborah, we're going to look at some of the minor judges. And the minor judges are sort of sprinkled throughout the book of Judges. But one of the things we're going to see with the minor judges is that they are all kings in the making. The way that they are typically portrayed, especially in chapter 10 and 12, they're portrayed as kings. Because kings, when they're typically listed, like when you read through Samuel's and the Kings, they're typically listed with the cities that they've conquered, with their sons and the amount of concubines that they've had, and with them being listed with those descriptors in Judges makes you think that these are kings. So it's one of those issues that we're going to wrestle with throughout Judges: is who's the real king of Israel? Is it Yahweh, or is it these human kings? It should be Yahweh, But the people keep pushing for human kings, and the way that these minor judges are listed, even though they have only a couple lines of scripture, makes it seem like they have been set up as kings. So we're going to be seeing that. The next one we're going to get into is Gideon. Gideon is like the focal point of the book. Gideon, I don't want to say this. He sort of gets things right, but he really ends up getting everything wrong. At the end of his story, he's basically set himself up as king. He's made a foreign idol, which he worships and sort of tempts Israel to worship. And he basically does everything wrong by the end. He's not acting as Yahweh would want him to act, but he's trying to act in place of Yahweh as king of Israel. And you just have to kind of read some subtleties in the text to sort of see this, and we're going to get to that whenever we get to the Gideon story. But he's sort of the focal point of the book, because the book has a chiastic structure, which basically a chiastic structure is like a big X. So if you were to draw an X, if you look at where the X intersects, that's sort of the focal point. And so you have a lot of things funneling into the Gideon story and then funneling back out of the Gideon story. So Gideon is portrayed as the focal point of the book. And this is where you see this, it's not really a reversal, but you see this stark point being made that Gideon is setting himself up as king. And that's not what should be happening. Yahweh is the king of Israel and no one else. Yahweh is just setting up deliverers, and deliverers not supposed to take the role of a king. And so we see that with Gideon. And tacked on to Gideon is Abimelech, which is the next one we're going to look at. Abimelech is not actually a deliverer. Nowhere is it said that he is a deliverer of Israel. He is Gideon's son, because Gideon has like 70 sons or something like that. But Gideon is his son, and his name means my father is king. So this really helps us understand the Gideon story, because why would Gideon, who's only a deliverer of Israel, name his son my father is king if Gideon himself didn't think he was king? So the Abimelech story is really helps us understand what Gideon was doing and how he was trying to set himself up as king, and it's just not good. As we see, the downward spiral continues. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The people are supposed to be going after Yahweh as their king, but they're basically constantly doing the opposite, and this just is not good. Then we get to the Jephthah story, and Jephthah basically teaches us that Yahweh is not manipulated. Jephthah tries to use Yahweh in a very mechanistic, mechanical sense of, if I do this, then God is forced to do that. And he learns the hard way that God is not manipulated. God cannot be forced into a corner, so to speak. And so we learn that through the Jephthah story. And then comes Samson. Samson is by far the worst of the worst judges. He is born from a barren mother, so he's sort of a miraculous child in a sense. And he is dedicated as a Nazirite from his birth, but he does not pay attention to his Nazirite vows. In fact, he breaks every aspect of those Nazirite vows, and he only cries out to God when it suits him, when he wants what he wants. And so Samson is basically the worst of the worst. He goes after foreign women. He does deliver Israel from the Philistines, which shows God's sovereignty, because that's what he raised him up for. But Samson is the worst of the worst. He shows what it's like when God uses you as an instrument instead of an agent. And that's one of the refrains that's going to be happening throughout this book. We're going to see, do you want God to use you as an agent or an instrument? Because an instrument doesn't understand or even know what the person using the instrument for is doing. Whereas an agent partners with the person and goes along with them. So the question we really have is, with God or with Yahweh, do you want to be his agent or his instrument? Do you want to partner with God and understand what he's doing and get in line with him and understand his ways as an agent? Or do you merely want to be God's instrument where you don't have a clue what's going on, but God still works through you, typically through pain and suffering, to carry out his will? And so Samson kind of encapsulates that really well. We're going to see that through his story and really through a lot of the other judges, but Samson really is like the exclamation point at the end of the sentence of the book of Judges, basically saying, Yahweh should be your king, people, no earthly king, because they just cannot get it done. So that's sort of the meat of the book of Judges, is these character stories that takes us from chapter 3 all the way through chapter 16. Then comes the epilogue. Now, the epilogue is sort of the ending of the book of Judges, and you would think that the end of the story is usually kind of where the resolution comes, where you have some sort of understanding, but in Judges, it doesn't really work like that. We really don't reach any sort of climax in Judges. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and there's no happily ever after, or there's no real resolution. It just ends far worse than it ever began, and you're just left saying, like, what just happened? So in the epilogue, we have again this repeated pattern of religious decline and of political decline. And remember, religious decline is people to God relationships, and political decline is people to people relationships. But first comes the religious decline. In the religious decline, we see the tribe of Dan, which is one of the Israelite tribes. The tribe of Dan takes a Levite, which is one of the priests of Israel, and they basically form their own religion. Because Dan is not where the tribe of Dan is supposed to be. They're far north when they should be south, and they end up forming their own religion, and we'll sort of get into that when we get to this part of the story. But you see this religious decline. Not only did the people in the beginning of Judges reject Yahweh and worship the foreign gods of the land, now you have a tribe in Israel itself basically creating their own religion, creating their own idol, or stealing their own idol, and then using that as an object of worship, which is really bad. But this leads to basically what God warned the people about in Deuteronomy, about them becoming like the people of the land, because now, because Dan has done this, there's now no distinction between Israel and the people of the land. Israel looks like the people of the land, whereas they were supposed to eradicate the people of the land, or at least have the people of the land assimilate to their way of life, to worshiping Yahweh. But now you see that Israel was seduced away from Yahweh, and there's sort of this downward spiral of religious decline. And so now Yahweh is regulated as another god of the land. And that is worse than in the beginning, because in the beginning they just rejected Yahweh and worshiped the other gods. Now they're saying Yahweh is no better than another god of the land, which is horrible. So this religious decline gets even worse and worse and worse, just like the downward spiral. So that's the religious decline in the epilogue. Now there's political decline in the epilogue, which is people-to-people friction. So in the ending part of Judges from 19 to 21, we have the story about the concubine. About the concubine basically being horribly mistreated, essentially raped to death, and is an atrocity. And this atrocity happens within Israel, among Israelites. The people-to-people conflict in the beginning of the book was Israel against the people of the land. Now, it's Israel against itself. And this great atrocity happens in Israel by Israelites to other Israelites. Like, it's just, such a thing ought not to be. This is just terrible. And the result of this concubine story is that the tribe of Benjamin, because that's where this happens, in their allotted land, the tribe of Benjamin is nearly wiped out, because all Israel comes against Benjamin and basically almost destroys them. So instead of Israel fighting against the people of the land like they should be in the beginning, but in the beginning they started to assimilate, now Israel has not only assimilated with the people of the land, now they're fighting against themselves. So you see the downward spiral, religious decline and the political decline. Things couldn't get any worse. And there's no resolution here. It is just worse upon worse upon worse, and you're just left with it. So let's take a moment and look at some of the background and foreground scriptures. So Deuteronomy helps a lot in setting up what's going to be happening throughout Judges. There's a lot of warnings for the consequences of disobedience that God outlines in Deuteronomy. And he also outlines the characteristics of a king. So it was really okay for Israel to have a king, but it had to be God's way. And God's way was that a king wouldn't have a lot of horses, not a lot of wives, not a lot of money, and all this kind of stuff, which doesn't sound like much of a king because all the foreign kings had exactly those things. So in Deuteronomy, we see the stage being set for what's going to happen when they are disobedient and for the type of king that they should have. And we see that they fulfill the consequences for being disobedient, right? And they reject Yahweh's version of a king and they want a foreign version of a king. So Deuteronomy helps set the background for all the trouble that they're going to get in Judges. Now, moving on to the book of Joshua. Joshua is the book right before Judges, and it sets up the conquest of the Promised Land. However, there's a distinction we need to make between conquest and occupying. Joshua is all about conquering the land, subduing the kings, bringing their government system, if you will, under the rule and control of Israel. Okay, that's what they did in the book of Joshua. However, the people still had yet to occupy their land because Joshua divided up the inheritances. And then he said, okay, now that the land is subdued, that we've defeated the kings and stuff, you different tribes go into your areas and actually drive the people out of the land. Take over their villages and their towns and eradicate the people. So there was still work to be done at the end of Joshua, even though the scripture makes it seem like they had finished their job. What they had done was just conquer. They hadn't necessarily occupied the land. So the individual tribes, Asher and Dan and Naphtali and all those other people, they still had to go and occupy their land and push those people of the land, the foreigners, out of those towns and villages. And so Joshua helped set the stage for that their job has not completely been done, that the generation of Joshua didn't finish it all, that the next generation needed to complete the occupying of the land, which, as we know, in the beginning of Judges is going to tell us, they failed to do that. Instead of conquering the people and pushing them out, they assimilated with them and used them as slaves, but that still ensnared them, so it didn't work out very well. One of the other things I want us to look at as a setup for Judges is Israel's idolatry. They have had a very, very long history of idolatry. This goes all the way back to really when Abraham was called by God and left Babylon and came all the way over to the Promised Land. He brought gods with him, or his party of people that he was traveling with brought foreign gods with them. And Joshua confronts the people of Israel at the end of the book of Joshua and tells them, you guys have a choice to make as we go into the Promised Land, or as we continue to occupy the Promised Land. Are you going to worship the gods that you knew from beyond the river, like Abraham's gods? Or are you going to worship the gods that you came to know in Egypt? Or are you going to worship the gods in the land that you are now? You need to make a choice who you're going to worship, these gods or Yahweh. And as we find out, the people choose the foreign gods instead of Yahweh. But Israel has had a long history of idolatry. It started with Abraham's gods, but then also when they were in Egypt. I mean, remember, they were in Egypt for 400 years. 400 years in Egypt, knowing about the sun god, the god of the Nile, all the different Egyptian gods. You know that some of those Israelites went astray. And then they taught their children that. Because, you're 400 years in one place, looking after one way of life, you being slaves and stuff. Like, there's going to be some assimilation of those gods. You just know it. So they knew about the Egyptian gods. And then you go into Canaan, right? And now it's a agricultural area. Israel's no longer nomadic like they were for the last 40 years or so, wandering around in Israel. And they learn about how the Canaanite gods are used to make the land fertile and give them the right crops. There's a lot of seduction going on here. That's why God said you need to completely eradicate these people and their gods, because they're going to be seductive to you, and they were. So Israel's had a long history of idolatry, and whether it was from Egypt or from the new land that they were going into Canaan. But this all leads up to what we see in Judges, that honestly it's not surprising that they choose the foreign gods of the land and not Yahweh himself. What does become interesting is that by the end, they relegate Yahweh as another little god of the land. And that just does not sit well. It's one thing to reject Yahweh and say, you know what? I don't want you, Yahweh. I want to worship these other gods. It's another thing to say, Yahweh, you're no different than these little gods. That's far more severe. And so we're going to see that happening in the background and in the lead up to Judges. So that's the background scriptures. The other thing we're going to find is some of the foreground scriptures. Let me get caught up here in my notes. So the foreground scriptures. The book of Ruth immediately follows Judges, and there are some connections there. Ruth talks about, I think in some of the opening lines of that book, that it is during the time of the Judges that there was a famine in the land, and so I think it's Epilogue is his name, and his wife Naomi leave the promised land to go find food or find a better place to live in Moab or something like that, and that's where Ruth comes into play. But there's connections between Ruth and Judges in that sense. But also in Ruth, we see a correction of the paradigm set forth in Judges. Because in Judges, the Israelite people went in to the promised land, were seduced by the people of the land to marry their women and to take on their gods, and they prostituted themselves to foreign gods. What we see in Ruth is a foreign woman come into the promised land to an Israelite man, and she adopts the gods of the Israelite man, right, Yahweh. And what you see is a correction of the paradigm. That's how it should happen. Foreigners should come into the promised land and see Israel and how they worship and choose to take on the God of Israel, Yahweh. So you see sort of a correction of the paradigm that happens in Judges. You see that corrected in Ruth by Ruth being a foreign woman, a Moabite woman coming into the promised land and taking on the God of Boaz, Yahweh. And through Ruth, then comes the line of David. Because Ruth, I think, is the grandmother of David because she has David's father. And then obviously David's father has him. So you see this line of redemption because Ruth, the story of Ruth gets it right. Foreigners should be seduced into loving Yahweh, not the other way around, of the people of Israel being seduced to follow foreign gods. So Ruth kind of helps correct that paradigm. Another foreground scripture, kind of something that happens after Judges, is 1 Samuel. There's a strong connection between Samuel and Samson. Samuel and Samson were both born of barren women. They both were Nazarites from birth. Samson gets it way wrong. Samuel gets it right. Samuel is the type of judge that Samson should have been. So we see, again, another correction of that paradigm. And it all happens within the context of the line of David. Ruth, from David comes Ruth, from Ruth comes David, And then in 1 Samuel, this is the whole issue with Saul and David fighting for the kingship, sort of. But you see this redemption starting in 1 Samuel because Samuel gets it right, Samson gets it wrong. And then later we're going to find in 1 Samuel about Saul being king and then David being king, that Saul essentially gets it wrong and David essentially gets it right because David has a heart after God, whereas Saul, he actually starts out right, but then he goes bad. So we sort of see that connection there. And Israel finally gets their demand, have a king, and it's exactly everything God warned them it was going to be about. So we see that happening in Samuel. Because in Judges, their whole thing throughout it, kind of a subtlety in the text, is that they want a king just like these foreign kings. And God doesn't give it to them. He just gives them a deliverer. But finally they get their king in 1 Samuel, and it's exactly everything God warned them it would be. It's a total disaster. Anyways, another thing that happens is Israel's continued idolatry. Israel's kings, for the most part, they're all bad, or they all do very foolish things and lead the people of Israel into further levels of idolatry. Sometimes they sort of recede that a little bit, but then they go deeper. Then they kind of retreat it more, and then they go back into it. But there's always a struggle with idolatry because of the leadership. Because as goes the leadership, so go the people. And Israel's kings do not get it right. And this eventually leads to the great exile, where God eradicates his people from the land and puts them into foreign bondage in Assyria and in Babylon, and the promised land is left barren. God's people aren't there. Of course, there's sort of like a remnant there, but for the most part, his people are destroyed and are conquered and are taken away because they don't do it God's way. Okay, so we've said a lot, and there's a lot more still to sort of say because I want to kind of cover everything in this one presentation as an overview so we can get a good grasp instead of breaking this into parts. But as we move forward through the text, we'll break it into probably half-hour increments or something like that. Anyways, so let's look at some of the overarching themes. Some of the themes in the scripture, and as we kind of already pointed out, we're going to find idolatry is a big thing. People of Israel just going after foreign gods. It's going to be a big theme. We're also going to see the flawed judge. As we said, it's the downward spiral, and each judge just sort of keeps getting worse in one way or another, and we're going to see these flawed judges. But through these flawed judges, we're going to see that God is still sovereign. He still is delivering his people. His will is still being carried out, even if it's through these very, very flawed people. We're also going to see throughout Judges the kingship being satirized. So think about Saturday Night Live. You know how they make fun of political figures and stuff like that? That's sort of what Judges is doing here. They're making fun of kingship. Like, Israel, why would you ever want a king? Look at all these foreign kings. They're so dumb. They're stupid. They can't get anything done. They can't even rule their own people. Why would you want that ruling over you? You should just stick with Yahweh as your king. So they make fun of foreign kingship, and they make fun of Israel for wanting foreign kingship. That's sort of one of the themes running throughout the text, and we're going to hit on that when we look at the judges compared to the foreign kings that they are defeating and stuff. Women is another theme in the text. Women show up all over the place. You have Deborah and Jael, the woman with the upper millstone who crushes Abimelech's head. You have the Levite's concubine. Women are all throughout the text. However, this is not a rah-rah moment for women, as if trying to put women up on a pedestal and say, this is how great women are. Because remember, this is an ancient text, and women and men were viewed differently back then than they are now. So we have to sort of suspend some of our modern understandings of these things and put on some ancient eyes and see what the writer of Judges is trying to communicate. Because what the writer of Judges is doing is he's using women to essentially slap men in the face. Women are used in order to degrade men. Basically to say, you see, men, you can't get it done. I have to use a woman in order to fulfill these things. Because men, you are so inept. You cannot lead. You can't get the job done. So it's really like a slap in the face to men, the way that women are being used. Because Jael taking out the commander of the foreign army instead of Barak, that's a slap in the face because Barak is the military commander. He's the one that's supposed to be doing that. But yet you have this woman who has no military training, who invites this man into her tent, and while he's sleeping, she kills him. Like, it's meant to slap Barak in the face. It's not really meant to elevate Jael. Although you can say that to a certain extent it sort of does, but it's definitely meant to slap Barak in the face. And so that's really what ends up happening there with how women are being used in the text. Also, we see the theme of unity in the text. It starts out with Yahweh's people being united together against the people of the land, right? They're fighting as one against the people that are in the promised land to fulfill God's promise of giving them the promised land. But as you go through the scripture, and as we get to the end, we find that unity is totally gone. Israel is now fighting against Israel, and it's just really bad. So unity goes from Israel being one in the beginning, well, sort of being one in the beginning, to by the end of the text, they are fighting one another. And it's not good. It's not good. There's just a total disintegration of unity. And some of the characteristics of the themes, what we're going to see happening really with all of these themes throughout the scripture, is that they go from bad to worse. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Just keeps getting worse with each one of these themes. One of the other things we're going to see is the assimilation with the people of the land. Israel starts to become indistinguishable from the people of the land because they start treating Yahweh as a little God, and they start taking on not only the wives of the foreign land, so they take the people of the land and they marry their women and they become their wives and have children, so they literally are assimilating with them. But they're also taking on their gods and stuff like that, and it's just not working out very well for them at all. Another way that these themes are characterized is that trust in God moves to trust in man. You see these really well through the Judges. That Othniel trusts in God, or it's assumed that he's trusting in God, and he's able to deliver Israel. But as we keep going through the Judges, we see that they are trusting more and more in themselves and in a mechanistic process with God of, God, if I do this, then you have to do that because we have this deal. And it's really a trust in themselves and in the deal that's being made, and not faith in God, which is a really big thing. Sex is also a huge driving force in this book. The people are marrying the women of the land. There's a lot of how do I want to characterize this? Sexual sin in the sense of the rape of the Levite concubine and the Benjaminites stealing women, and Samson falling for Philistine women, and Delilah, the whole thing. So sex is a big driving force in this book, and it shows it in a very negative light. Like, sex is not a good thing in this sense because you're misusing it. And then chaos. Chaos just continually increases, and that kind of goes along with things going from bad to worse. But things just keep getting more and more chaotic, especially as the unity starts to disintegrate. Israel starts fighting against itself. It just becomes total chaos. It's just crazy. However, through all of these themes, one of the things that stands out is that we see that God is sovereign. Yahweh is sovereign through it all. Because even when things go from bad to worse and things continually get more chaotic and people are trusting more in themselves and in God, Yahweh is still delivering his people from the foreign kingship, and he is still having his will be done through these flawed people. The will of Yahweh will never be stopped. That's one of the huge kind of themes running through this book that we're going to see, and you see it through each one of these main themes, is that God is sovereign through it all. Now, there are some secondary themes that sort of present itself in the text I want to take a few moments to go over. The tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is cast in a very negative light in Judges in order to discredit Saul's kingship. So Saul, who is the first king of Israel, he shows up in 1 Samuel. He is a Benjaminite. He's from the town of Gibeah, and he's the first Israelite king. Now, the whole conflict in Judges with the Levite concubine at the end of the book of Judges deals with Benjaminite people from the town of Gibeah. So this horrible rape atrocity that happens there is meant to basically tell the reader nothing good comes out of Gibeah of Benjamin. And who comes out of Gibeah of Benjamin? Saul. So it's meant to sort of say Saul is not a good king because he comes out of Gibeah of Benjamin, and they're the people that rape, so to speak. Or it's at least designed to put Saul's kingship into a negative light. So that's a theme that sort of runs through the text, and it sort of runs counter to David's kingship. David's kingship is shown in a positive light because you see Ruth, the book of Ruth, right after Judges, and Ruth puts David's kingship in a positive light because it corrects the paradigm, or it helps correct the paradigm of Judges. So anyways, we'll get more into that if we have time, hopefully. Another thing, a secondary theme that runs through the text, is the geography of the text. We're going to start off in the south and move more and more to the north in the geography of Israel. And the more northward we go, the worse all of these themes become. And the result is that the tribe of Dan forms their own religion outside of the allotted territory. So let me pull up this map over here. Okay, and I want you to see this is the promised land. You have Reuben and Gad and Manasseh outside the promised land because the Jordan kind of marks the boundary for the promised land. And then you have all the tribes inside here. Simon, Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Dan, Manasseh, the other part of Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher. The little red dot is Jerusalem, and the blue dot is Nazareth, just so you have some locating features of Israel. One thing I want you to notice, you have Dan in the south. You also have Dan in the north. Why is that? Well, the Danites were allotted territory in the south, but they could not overcome the Philistines because the Philistines covered the coast. They could not overcome the Philistines, so they moved to the north, way outside of position, way up here. Because they were outside of position and really weren't doing what God asked them to do, they ended up becoming really apostate and forming their own religion with their own idol that they stole from Micah. It's this whole crazy story, but we're going to read about that. But this is one of the themes that goes through the text, that as we move from the south to the north, things get worse and worse and worse because Dan becomes way out of position. So we're going to kind of see that happening in the text. Okay, and there's going to be a lot of intertextual connections. And really what I mean by that is that the stories, the character stories of the book are connected together through word usage and similar patterns. So we're going to see that happen with a lot of the stories, and we'll kind of get there whenever we get there. And the last point I really want to make about some of these secondary themes, and I sort of talked about it a little bit earlier, is that the Bible is a theology book. Chronology and history play second fiddle in the Bible and in Judges in particular. The writers, especially the writer of Judges, they're making a point theologically. They're using history and chronology, of course, but those things play second fiddle. And we're going to sort of get into some specific examples in Judges, but we have to understand that this is a theology book, so we need to read it theologically and not pay attention so much to history or chronology, because that's not the author's intention. He's not trying to give you a blow-by-blow action of what happened in Israel at this time. He's not concerned about that. He's concerned about teaching you about God. So we need to have eyes where we're looking for what he is teaching about God so that we can actually see and understand that and get the theological point and not get lost in some of the history and chronology, because that's not the point of what he's writing. So let's keep that in mind. So this is what we've looked at so far today. We've looked at the structure of Judges, the prologue, the character stories, the epilogue. We looked at some of the background and foreground scriptures, kind of what comes before Judges and then what comes after Judges. And we also looked at some overarching themes that we're going to see pop up in the scripture throughout the whole time. Things that we kind of need to be aware of now, so that as we're reading through Judges and studying through it, we can pick up on these themes and sort of get the most bang for our buck the first time we roll through it. So next time, for the next session, we're going to start the downward spiral. And we're going to see just how things get started off on the wrong foot. Of course, why wouldn't it get started off on the wrong foot? So we're going to be going through the prologue. So what you need to do is read chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6. So read the prologue, that first chunk of scripture. And it's only like a few pages, but read it. And one of the things I want you to do when you're reading it is I want you to think about the political decline and the religious decline. Now remember, the political decline is the people-to-people interactions, and the religious decline is the people-to-God interactions. So I want you to be thinking about those two things as you are reading through the prologue. And I want you to also ponder this question and try and come up with an answer for it. So the question is, how does Judges 2:10 inform us about the importance of parenting? So as you're going through the prologue, when you come to that scripture, sort of remember to pause and think about how this how this scripture informs us about the importance of parenting. And this is one of the very subtle themes running throughout the Bible and really throughout Judges too, is the importance of parenting. So I want you to be thinking about that when you read through Judges 2:10. But I want to leave you with this one last thing, which is this, the downward spiral. This book is best characterized by this image right here. And this is sort of going to be our mascot that follows us through Judges. It's the downward spiral. Things seem to repeat itself over and over again in Judges, but it's going somewhere, and it's going somewhere horribly bad because it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, just like the final point that actually touches the ground, like thinking about a tornado, how that's where all the damage happens. So this is sort of going to be our mascot and serve as that throughout this time as we're going through this study of Judges. But until the next time, be blessed and remember to read the prologue and think about that question. And I will see you in the next one.